listening to Ohio v. the World, an Ohio history podcast. The only podcast dedicated exclusively to the history of the Buckeye State. Subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. And don't forget to rate and review us. Join the conversation now at Facebook. Stream and donate to the show at OhioVTheWorldPodcast.com. Now, here's your host, Alex Hasty.
It's hard to tell.
Hey guys, welcome back. It's season 3 of Ohio v. the World, the world's only Ohio history podcast, and I am your host, Alex Hasty. So good to be back with you guys, and we've got an awesome season planned. Really looking forward to it. We're starting with our first episode here about Neil Armstrong, called Ohio versus the Moon. Next week, and on Friday, October 19th, we hope to see you at our launch party, our season 3 launch party. Anyone who's been to any of our previous launch parties knows how fun those are. Cash bar, we'll be in Grandview at the Columbus Italian Club. All our listeners are welcome. Dinner will be there, be a buffet dinner. First come, first serve on that from the Berwick Manor. Great Italian food. We're just asking for a $5 donation. All proceeds go to our nonprofit to promote Ohio history across the state. So we had an awesome summer. We joined the board of the Ohio History Connection, formerly the Ohio Historical Society. We're very excited. We'll talk more about that as this episode goes on, as this season goes on. Since we joined the Ohio History Connection here in Columbus, we found that they actually manage 58 sites across the state. I'm on the sites committee, and I'm trying to visit all 58 of those here in the next year or so. But one of those 58 sites is the Armstrong Air and Space Museum in Wapakoneta, Ohio. The county seat of Auglaize County in northwest Ohio is the hometown of Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. So we went out today, and that's where we did our interviews. We did kind of a roundtable discussion with 3 really leading Neil Armstrong experts, and we had an awesome time in Wapakoneta. We were actually there just last night for the premiere. They had a big premiere of the movie First Man, which comes out the same day as this podcast is hitting the airwaves, starring Ryan Gosling as Neil Armstrong, and a big feature film that comes out. It looks fantastic. We were there last night for the premiere in Wapakoneta as the guests of the Armstrong Air and Space Museum. Big fundraiser up there to raise money. We had a big outdoor dinner tent, and then actually went and saw the movie in the old historic theater in Wapakoneta. So really fun times. Thanks again to them. Our beer for the episode, we are drinking the Binary Star Black IPA from our friends at Land Grant Brewing here in Columbus. You can check their tap room out on West Town Street in Franklinton, landgrantbrewing.com. The Binary Star Black IPA, 7.8%, but it's got, it's a dark beer, dark IPA, black IPA, but it's got these kind of citrusy floral finishes that I love in my pale ales. But it's also got that dark malt, almost like a caramel, smell to it. So check it out. It's part of their Space Grant series. Land Grant will be providing all the beer for our launch party, Friday, October 19th. We'll be drinking Land Grant beers, and all our listeners are invited to that at the Columbus Italian Club in Grandview. Today we're talking about Neil Armstrong. We'll go down as the biggest, most famous person from Ohio. When you say 200-300 years from now, who will they remember? They're not going to remember Rutherford B. Hayes. They're not going to remember Warren G. Harding, but they will remember Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. We went to Wapakoneta to do a roundtable interview. And you ask, we were off for 5 months. It's been 5 months since our last episode to end season 2, our live episode from the Columbus Podcast Festival. And we asked, well, what have you been doing? First of all, I love my springs and summers off. But also we're researching. Because I got to know my stuff. When I walk into a room with people like Greg Brown, the experience coordinator at the Armstrong Air and Space Museum, or the Brittany Venturella, the interim director up at Armstrong Air and Space, and our friend who hooked all this up, Craig Noble. He's a board member up at the Armstrong Air and Space Museum in Wapakoneta. I got to know what I'm talking about because these 3 know it all. And they were awesome to sit down with. They were super gracious with their time. They took me through the museum, which was fantastic. ArmstrongMuseum.org. You got to go see it. A great little couple hours that you can spend there. They're doing an expansion. We'll talk about all the new and exciting stuff that's going on there. And, of course, all the interest with the movie with First Man and Ryan Gosling. We'll talk about when he came to the museum with Brittany, doing his research for the film. And I urge you to go see it. It is an awesome movie. It's a blockbuster feature film made about Ohio history, so I'm going to be down with it. We had so much fun at the premiere last night. Because this moon event on July 20th, 1969, Sunday night, primetime TV, when Neil Armstrong steps off around 10 p.m. Eastern. You've got to understand the importance to the people who saw it. It was a moment where we all came together, everyone across the world, through the magic of television and the magic of science and exploration, shared this immense moment in human history. So we're going to play some of that for you as it was on TV, as people crowded around television sets all over the world. But without further ado, it's time to buckle up. It's liftoff of Season 3. It's Episode 1, Ohio vs. the Moon.
Step off the limb. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Columbia, this is Houston, AOS, over. Houston, Columbia, 9 over. Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. It's setting up the flight now. You're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage.
Neil Armstrong's born in 1930, just outside of Wapakoneta in the kind of New Knoxville or St. Mary's, Ohio area. About an hour north of Dayton and about 90 minutes northwest of Columbus. And one of our guests today, Craig Noble, his grandfather actually was a doctor who delivered Neil Armstrong. And Craig has lived in the area all his life. He's an attorney, a board member at the Armstrong Air and Space Museum. And he told us the story of the young Neil Armstrong. But what was it about this part of Ohio? You have the Wright brothers from just down the road in Dayton. Go back and listen to Season 1, Episode 8, our episode Ohio versus Flight. Neil actually brought a piece of the Wright Flyer on his trip to the moon. We'll play a clip from one of our favorite historians, David McCullough, about this area of western Ohio.
Well, there's something particularly American about the Ohio story. And it's, when you look at who came from Ohio and what they did, it's quite remarkable. Presidents, inventors, and there's a strange coincidence, and maybe it isn't a coincidence, that the first human being ever to fly in a flying machine, Orville Wright, and the first human being ever to set foot on the moon came from the same section of southwestern Ohio, Neil Armstrong. And then, of course, John Glenn also came from Ohio, as did Edison, as did numerous other people in that very protein time.
Brittany Venturella joined us as well. She's the Interim Director of Armstrong Air and Space. And we asked her just about his first flight. The Armstrongs moved around, mostly around Ohio. But we asked about his first flight as a child.
Neil Armstrong's first flight was in Warren, Ohio. His father took him, instead of going to Sunday school because the rates were cheaper in the morning, they took their flight in a Ford Trimotor. And as his father tells it, Neil thoroughly enjoyed his experience, and perhaps that was one of the defining moments of his love of aviation.
And so he was how old?
Just shy of his sixth birthday.
Yeah, close to 6 years old.
But Neil is pretty clearly a special kid. One of the examples, he moves back to Wapakoneta when he's about 14. He goes to the high school there downtown. The museum's got a bunch of great stuff from his yearbook and from his childhood. But one of the weird things that he did that kind of showed that he was going to be a different kid when it comes to science and engineering, he built his own wind tunnel at his house. He'd do tests and put little planes in this wind tunnel that he built. It was pretty serious. We ask our guests about the wind tunnel. And we also ask about, is it true that he got his pilot's license before he ever got his driver's license?
Yes, it is true that he built a wind tunnel, and it was actually in the basement of his Benton Street home during his high school years. It wasn't necessarily for a school project, but it shows that he was not only interested in piloting, but really the engineering behind it. And it was made up of junk or spare parts that he put together, and it would have had 4 small fans, and he was working on a rheostat that would change the electrical current to make the fan spin slower or faster so that there was different air flow through the tunnel. And the story goes that they blew several fuses, and according to a family member, he put a penny in one of the fuses at one point just so that he could keep experimenting with it as well.
So do you have like a little plane in there that he built, or?
So he would have had different planes that he would have flown through.
I think throughout his life he continued to build models, even when he was an astronaut. That was one of his passions.
Well, he began taking lessons at Port Conita with a group, and they called themselves the Port Conita Gang. It was just basically a dirt strip, a hard-packed dirt airstrip.
And so he gets that and then gets his driver's license later?
Later. He got his license on his student license at age 16 on his 16th birthday.
His pilot's license?
Yep, so August 5th of 1946.
Wow.
And he learned to fly in an Aranca Champion, which was made in Middletown.
Ohio.
And there would have been one of 2 at the airport, and we actually have on display the one that he learned to fly in.
Neil graduates and moves to Northwest Indiana and goes to Purdue University, a Big Ten school, the Boilermakers, known to be a great engineering school. But part of it was he had to get it as part of a scholarship with the Navy. He quickly gets called up in 1949 after a couple years at Purdue, and he becomes a pilot. And just a year later, the country goes to war in Korea. President Truman declares war after the North Koreans invade South Korea in 1950. We asked our guest Greg Brown, the experience coordinator at Armstrong Air and Space, just about his experience in Korea and how he became a top pilot, and how on his dozens of missions over the skies of North Korea nearly lost his life.
And he started at Purdue right out of high school, but in 1949 he was brought on board, no pun intended, to train as an aviator. And once he finished his training in Pensacola, he was assigned to a squadron VF-51. And that squadron was then placed on the USS Essex, and the Essex sailed for the Pacific. And so the Essex served, I think, 3 tours or 3 cruises. During that conflict, Neil's job was to fly basically ground attack missions in an F-9F Panther. That was his squadron. They all flew Panthers, the same aircraft that John Glenn actually flew as a Marine. So anyway, those F-9Fs were not really suitable for dogfighting very much, so they were relegated to that ground attack role. So Neil, flying those kind of missions, he ended up flying a total of 78 combat missions in that aircraft. Wow. And the crisis that we're kind of interested in came in September of 1951. And at this time, he was flying through the Wonsan Valley. Wonsan is a port city on the eastern coast of North Korea. And he's flying through this valley, and his aircraft strikes a cable that had been strung up there by the enemy. There are various stories as to how this damage occurred. Many stories say that he was hit by anti-aircraft or flak. Some say he hit a pole. Actually, those are not true, according to Neil. He was simply flying through the valley, strikes a cable. The cable is strung up about 500 feet off the deck, as that's about the altitude he was. He was moving at about 350 miles per hour, and the F-9F, as we just saw, it's not a big airplane. So those wings are not very long. He strikes this cable with his right wing, and it slices off 6 feet of that wing.
Just a good third or a half of that wing.
Yeah, I would think. So here he is. He's moving that fast. He strikes the cable. He loses 6 feet of his wing, and at that point he's lost his wing tank. He's lost some hydraulic fluid, and the distance between where he was and where he ended up eventually coming back and ejecting was significant. There was a decent amount of space in between those 2 places. So he's able to kind of hang on to the aircraft, fight the stick, keep it from rolling over, and he's able to pilot it back over Pohang, which is a southern port city on the same side of the country. So he punches out at that point. His intent was to land in the ocean. He's a naval aviator. They always want to land in the water. But the prevailing wind blew him on to the coast, and he lands in a rice paddy on his tailbone. So very, very quickly he was picked up, and he avoided landing in North Korea and being captured or being killed. So, but very hairy, because I don't know, what the average pilot would have been able to do, but I have a feeling that was a very difficult thing to do.
You know, they were flying very dangerous missions. They weren't dogfighting, but these ground attack missions ran into a lot of anti-aircraft fire, and how they would go in and attack these bridges and railroad yards, but they'd have extreme flak. And eventually they developed a system of doing it was a lot safer, and Neil was involved in that.
Following the war, he finishes at Purdue. He marries Janet Sheeran. Janet would be his wife well into the 1990s. She's played by Claire Foy in the movie First Man. You might remember her as Queen Elizabeth in The Crown, a great British actress. And she does a wonderful job in the movie and has a major role, as the movie is a lot about family as well. He takes a job in Cleveland. It's a research job, but he's flying. He's a research pilot, a test pilot. He takes a job in Cleveland at the Great Lakes, which now is called the Glenn Research Center. It's a NASA facility in Cleveland, Ohio, the Glenn Research Center. We asked Greg about his time in Cleveland on the North Coast and how his job as a test pilot began his journey to become an astronaut and the first man to land on the lunar surface.
Yes, he was only there 4 or 5 months. He was originally assigned as an aeronautical research pilot. So his intent was to get into test piloting, and he obviously wants to do some engineering, but he wants to do a lot of flying as well. So he's unfortunately, he spent a lot of time investigating new anti-icing systems for aircraft up there. He also studied high Mach number heat transfer. He was flying a very strange aircraft, a P-82, which is a twin Mustang. Instead of a P-51, it's a P-82. And they carried a solid rocket underneath. And they were doing a lot of research. So he did a lot of number crunching, a lot of analyzing data, a lot of charts and graphs. And he was designing components for some of these new pieces of equipment. So he enjoyed that. But when he heard about what was going on at Edwards with the X-15 and some of these other experimental aircraft, that really got his attention. He thought, I want to be a part of that.
But Cleveland's kind of his first almost NASA job.
Yes, it was.
In the early to mid-1950s, test pilots were all the rage. Chuck Yeager, breaking the speed of sound, going Mach 2, the right stuff. Neil Armstrong was there. He takes a job at Edwards Air Force Base as a test pilot, and he's one of the best ever. But it's an incredibly dangerous job. Not really the kind of job where you can get life insurance, as an astronaut or as a test pilot. We talked to Greg about the dangers of being a test pilot in the 1950s with his experimental jet aircrafts, rockets, really the beginning of the space program.
In the year 1952 alone, at Edwards alone, comes from First Man, 62 test pilots were killed in 1 year. So it's really hazardous, test piloting. And so you might say, and this is, I think, true to some degree, that test piloting is actually more challenging in some ways than astronaut flying is, simply because by the time a human being sits in a spacecraft, that spacecraft has been tested and retested. It has been put through the ringer.
Neil's flying the X-15, this rocket-powered airplane. It's just going crazy speeds, 4,000 miles an hour, Neil almost hits. There's a great scene in the film. Neil nearly leaves the Earth on one of these X-15s. We talked to Greg about that fateful day when he almost looked like he was going to leave the atmosphere. He was so high up that he can see space, that he can see over the horizon blackness, not the sun or the blue of the sky. As our guest, Greg Brown, informs us, Armstrong and the X-15 didn't have the exit velocity to actually leave the Earth and eventually would come down.
The X-15 was a very special aircraft designed to basically push the envelope and learn a whole bunch of new things about, obviously high altitude flight, very, very high velocity flight. So it literally had a rocket engine. That engine produced about 50,000 pounds of thrust. But it was used for these types of tests. And as a matter of fact, Neil ended up flying that type of aircraft 7 different times. His max speed was just a tad under 4,000 miles per hour. His max altitude was 39 statute miles. That's about 207,000 feet. At that altitude, the air is it's not non-existent. There is still some air there, but it's so thin that your wings, your control surfaces, no longer work. So it had to be equipped with little thrusters, and it was actually carried underneath a B-52 wing on one of the pylons, and it would be released, and then it would ignite the rocket engine and really soar up there in an arc but basically to the edge of the atmosphere, and it would return. The missions were typically very short. Sometimes they were as short as 10 minutes or so. So it was April 20th of 62. So this is just, the earlier part of the year before he became an astronaut. So what he wanted to do was test something called the MH96 G limiter. And the G limiter was what it sounds like. It was supposed to limit the amount of Gs that the pilot experienced to no more than 5 Gs. So he takes off, he drops from the underneath the wing of the aircraft, he ignites the rocket engine, and he just climbs. And as he's climbing, he's watching this G limiter. And the G limiter was supposed to kick in at 5 Gs. Well, it didn't kick in. So he keeps watching it. Meanwhile, he's climbing and climbing. He's really reaching a very, very high level in the atmosphere, and the atmosphere now is becoming very, very thin. So at some point, he realizes, wow, I might be beyond where I kind of plan to be. The radio starts coming alive, and the guys on the ground are saying, Neil, hard left turn. And he's thinking, boy, I wish I could. Because at this point, they said what he was doing was ballooning. His aircraft was literally just rising, just descending. It had a lot of inertia, a lot of kinetic energy, and it was just moving, just kept climbing. So here's the problem.
He's got like no air to grab on.
He's got no air. So what he does is he's firing his thrusters. Now, the thrusters are used to roll or pitch or yaw the aircraft, but that's assuming you have enough air to grab into. He had not enough air. He couldn't do anything about it. He was on an inertial pathway. He was just, if he yawed the aircraft, he was still going in a straight line. There's not enough air for him to get a bite, so he can't control it. So he's literally floating up there further and further.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
JFK makes that speech, a commencement speech at Rice University in Houston, during the height of the Cold War. The space race really was the ultimate proving ground for the Cold War. And we'll actually do an episode with our friend Bruce Carlson from one of our favorite shows, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, called Ohio versus the Cold War. We'll do that one later this season. But JFK, he challenges America to land on the moon before the decade is done. The decade, as Kennedy says in his Boston accent. But in truth, in 1962, we were far, far from being able to put anyone on the moon, or even the Apollo program. We were way behind the Soviets, who'd launched Sputnik first, who'd put a man in space first, who'd put a man in orbit first. At that time, it was a pipe dream that in nearly 7 years we could put something like this together. Following the Mercury program, when men like Alan Shepard did leave Earth, we talked to our roundtable about when Neil joins the NASA Astronaut Corps after getting a call from Deke Slayton. Neil joined the astronauts coming off personal tragedy when his 2-year-old daughter, Karen, died of brain cancer. That same year, Neil decided to follow his dreams and join the New Nine when he joined NASA's Gemini program.
Well, it was the in-between stage between Mercury and Apollo. And one of the basic goals of the Gemini program was to master the rendezvous and docking procedures.
And Mercury was really like a just try to leave Earth type of program,
correct.
Right? Okay.
Get our feet wet and expose the astronaut to orbital operations and see what they could do. Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the prizes of the museum is the Gemini capsule here. And it's amazing to look at to see how they could live in that for up to 2 weeks. One mission went that long in that cramped space.
It's also worth mentioning that while they were spinning, they would have had limited communication with NASA. So we already mentioned that test pilot abilities and how that played in. They had to problem solve very quickly and on their feet.
Yes.
Well, I guess sitting in the capsule. But
Wait a second. Did Brittany say spinning? Yeah. The Gemini mission does dock with the Agena target vehicle. They meet up. There's claps and cigars at mission control. They've done it. And for 27 minutes, they are docked with the Agena rocket, running through their tests. But then things start going wrong.
So they get hard docked, and then they go about doing some of their procedures that are revolving around joint maneuvers with the two. So they're docked for 27 minutes. And Dave and Neil have their cabin lights on, and they're looking at their checklists, and nothing particular exciting is happening until Dave just happens to look up from his checklist and see that his 8-ball, his attitude gyro, is wobbling around. And he thinks that's a little odd, so he kind of basically nudges Neil and says, "Neil, what's up with this?" So Neil says, "Well, I don't know, that's kind of anomalous." So they use the OMS, the Orbit Attitude Maneuver System. That's their system of thrusters. And Neil activates that, and he fires some thrusters and basically thinks that's going to be the end of it. They'll stabilize it, and they can go on. And as it turned out, this problem did not go away. And they realize now they've got something of a major issue, because no matter what they do, the two spacecraft are still wobbling. They're still rolling and spinning. They're not going too fast yet because of all the mass between the two of them. But they made a decision. It was very fateful. It was nearly the end of them. They looked out their windows, see the Agena. They see the other end of the Agena where the attitude control system is, and it's venting. And it's venting in such a way that it makes them believe perhaps the Agena is the cause of this wobbling and spinning. And yet, they also look inside their spacecraft, see the propellant quantity indicator, and they look at that and say, we were losing propellant too.
Right, and they weren't spinning before they docked with the Agena.
No, they were not. So they had no problems until they docked. So now it becomes a question of how do we sort this out, the various causes. What we need to do, they thought, is we'll undock from the Agena and we'll be able to sleuth it out, be able to kind of parse these out and figure out which one's causing it. And that was a decision, again, that almost cost them their lives. Because when they made that decision, they both agreed. Dave hit the docking switch after Neil basically neutralized most of the motion for a moment. And then when they separated, Neil hit the forward-facing thrusters, backed off from the Agena, and it immediately became obvious that this was going to be a bad day, because now they start spinning faster. Beginning to pick up speed because, again, you no longer have that mass on your nose and you have the same amount of thrust. Now, the sad thing is you can't look on your control panel and see which thruster is firing, if any. That's just not the way it's wired.
So the Agena was actually stabilizing them.
Yes, it was. Its mass was, yes. And so once they realized this, they knew that their options were narrowing significantly, and they had very, very few choices left.
So what would, I mean, when you say they had few options left, is that because they eventually keep spinning and pass out and float away?
Right, that's the problem. If you continue to spin, you're going to eventually black out. That's not something you want to do, because with the Gemini, you can't fly it from the ground. It's not like the Mercury. You can't fly it from the ground. So that becomes a real critical issue, and it turns out that these guys knew they were approaching that point. In fact, Dave says that, yes, we were nearing our physiological limits at that point. So they knew that they had just a matter of moments.
Call them. Gemini 8, CSQ Capcom, contact, how do you read? We got serious problems here with the forward coupling end over end, and we're disengaged from the Agena. Okay, we got you a spacecraft 3 indication here. Say again. We're showing you spacecraft 3. What seems to be the problem? They're rolling up and we can't turn anything off. Signaling increasing in a left roll. Go ahead, flight.
Did he say he could not turn the Agena off?
No, he says he is separated from the Agena and he's in a roll and he can't stop it. His reg pressure is down to 0, his ohms reg helium pressure. He's blown both RCS squibs, right.
Say again?
In a violent left roll here at the present time. We can't arm RCS is armed and we can't fire it. We currently have a roll, a stuck gas controller. Would you
copy flight. They seem to have a stuck thruster. They have initiated a squiz and blown them, but they can't seem to stop it or get them working. Did I hear him say he may have a stuck hand controller? That's affirmative, flight. Not a flight, this is CSQ. We can't seem to get any valid data here. He seems to be in a pretty violent trouble right now.
Neil has just seconds to make this decision. As he's spinning out of control, he decides, I don't know how he's able to think. I don't know how he's able to hit the right buttons when he's spinning this fast and his life's on the line. But he makes the fateful decision to activate the re-entry thrusters and boosters. By using that, he can slow the roll, but it ends the mission. He has to decide to either try and save his life or continue the mission. I know Dave Scott, who was on board with him that day, said, I'm glad I had Neil Armstrong next to me.
We've lost considerable gas pressure and it's way down. Okay, we're regaining control of the spacecraft slowly in RCS direct. Roger, copy.
They armed the reentry system, and that's in 2 rings, and that gives them a little bit of redundancy. But that system is not designed for orbital maneuvers whatsoever. Right. There's a limited amount of propellant in there. The duty cycle is very short, so it's not intended to be used in any other way except steering during reentry. But there was no choice. So it's a matter of arming the RCS, burning those thrusters for about 10 minutes or so, and neutralizing that spinning. And then once they did that, they stabilized the spacecraft after 25 minutes after the... In fact, I actually have a little timeline here. Just a real quick and dirty one, okay? 7 hours after launch, the anomaly began. They started rolling. Okay, 7 hours, 15 minutes, the undocking was initiated. 7 hours, 16 minutes, they activated the RCS, or the reentry control. 7 hours, 18 minutes, the OMS was deactivated, that major system of thrusters. And then 7 hours, 25 minutes, they nulled the rates in all axes, or they stopped the spinning.
So that's a crazy 10 minutes right
That's
there.
a crazy 10 minutes, which they were originally going to land in the Atlantic after 3 days, and they landed in the Pacific after 10 hours and 41 minutes.
Thanks for listening to Ohio v. the World. Every episode this season, we will bring you an Ohio History Connection Minute that is highlight the work being done to spark discovery of Ohio's stories. The Ohio History Connection, formerly the Ohio Historical Society, preserves and shares the history of the state of Ohio. In each episode, we'll talk with an employee of the OHC or someone from the over 50 sites we manage across the Buckeye State. I urge you to visit our museum, the Ohio History Center in Columbus, and become a member. Go to ohiohistory.org/join. So thanks for listening. Hope to see you at the History Center this year, and go to ohiohistory.org/join for membership info. Every episode this season, we're going to have an Ohio History Connection Minute. We'll talk with the people who run the Ohio History Connection. Today we'll talk with Brittany Venturella, the Interim Director of Armstrong Air and Space, which is one of our 58 sites across the state of Ohio. So exciting to do the work that we're doing. I can't wait to share with you some of these projects and really exciting things that are going on with Ohio history. You can always sign up to become a member at ohiohistory.org. And a member gets free admission to places like the Armstrong Museum. It's $8 for adults. It's open every day. In the winter, it's closed on Mondays. But they're open every day about 9:30 to 5. It's right at 33 and 75, where US 33 meets IS 75. And you really got to go and check it out. But they're doing a huge expansion. Very exciting. We talked to Brittany Venturella about the expansion.
So we are working to inspire people to go into STEAM, like we were just mentioning.
And explain what STEAM is, just so people know.
Science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And to do that, we are expanding on the north side of our building. We are adding a little over 1,600 square feet. 1,300 of that will be dedicated to a classroom, and that will allow us to accommodate more students to come in and explore the museum, and as well as offer activities in robotics and to the older students. Right now, we are really strong in our elementary and middle school, but this allows us to take it to that next level. And we'll also be expanding digitally as well. We'll have a green screen that our educators can then record lessons and place them online so people across the nation and maybe the world can explore.
In 2017, in preparation for the film The First Man, Ryan Gosling and director Damien Chazelle, the youngest Oscar-winning Best Director for La La Land, also with Ryan Gosling, in 2016, But Chazelle and Gosling actually came to Wapakoneta. They met with Brittany Venturella and our guest Greg Brown, and we asked her about that meeting, how cool it was to meet two Hollywood bigwigs coming to your museum to talk about Neil Armstrong. And did they know their stuff?
Yes, they came last year, and it was a research trip, and they toured the museum. Actually, Greg was one of the tour guides, and what impressed me was that they did their homework. They did a lot of research so that they knew what questions to ask. They wanted to make sure they got it right with, what buttons they pressed during the emergency and things like that. So they were very interested in the Gemini capsule. And then we corresponded back and forth on some research requests to make sure they got props accurate. And it was overall a good experience for us, and it instilled confidence in us for the movie's production.
He cheated death again 2 years later while flying an experimental device designed to simulate a lunar landing. When it malfunctioned, Armstrong was sitting at the controls. He ejected barely 100 feet from the ground.
And if you didn't get out, that would have been your life.
Yeah, probably would have.
Yet somebody told me that after that happened, when it was all over, you went back to your office and sat down to do paperwork.
That's true. I did. There was work to be done.
Wait a minute. You were just almost killed.
Oh, but I wasn't.
July 16th, 1969. Apollo 11 upon a Saturn V rocket, the biggest ever made. This is a few weeks before Woodstock, a very divisive time in our country. But we have this just restorative and just such an amazing human event. And they blast off on July 16th, 1969 at about 9:30 in the morning.
10, 9, ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program. Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
The flight to the moon takes about 3 days. And they approach on Sunday, July 20th, 1969. It's about 5 p.m. Eastern on Sunday when they near the lunar surface. Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, in what they call the Eagle, the lunar landing module, they begin to make their descent. Neil realizes that the guidance system is taking them into what he described as a boulder field. It was the crater, he said, the size of a football stadium, with boulders in it the size of cars. And that's when the test pilot, Neil Armstrong, takes control. He decides to land it in a different area. He takes control of the capsule. And we're going to play you that approach, and we're going to play it, from mission control, and really what people on television heard that afternoon, early evening on Sunday, July 20th. You'll hear fuel calls in the background, 60 seconds, 30 seconds. They try to stay off the comms because they don't want to pressure Neil, but the gas is getting low. If they're running out of fuel, if they drop the vehicle, it could be damaged. They could be stuck on the moon. They might have to abort the mission altogether. And all the while, there's all these alarms going off inside the vehicle. They're calling back to mission control to try to explain that. Greg said that maybe they did have a little more fuel, maybe 20 seconds more after the countdown hit 0, which it definitely did by the time they touched ground. We're going to listen to what it sounded like on TV, what it sounded like in mission control, and what it sounded like inside the Eagle as Neil Armstrong takes control and tries to guide and be the first person to land on the moon. Something that people have dreamed about, looked up at the stars and thought about for thousands and thousands of years. He's going to be the one to do it, if he can just get the Eagle down.
4 forward, drift into the right a little. Down a half. 30 seconds. Forward, just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent.
Mode control, both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. Port 13 is in.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
After they landed, they didn't just walk right out. There's actually like a rest period that NASA had put in there, where these astronauts are supposed to do some checks of the system. They're supposed to try and get some shut-eye. Obviously they really don't. And by now everyone's heard they've landed. And everyone who wasn't there in the afternoon, they're now rushing to their televisions as NASA announces that they're going to do the moonwalk. People run to friends and families, and everyone's watching on the TV. And this is all over the world. It's not just an American moment. But that's how badass it was, that really only the Americans this off. I urge you to go watch the Mad Men episode Waterloo. It's in the middle of season 7. But they do a great job of depicting what it was like for people to watch that moon landing live. At 9:55 Eastern Standard Time, Armstrong steps out of the Eagle and begins slowly making his way down the ladder. We'll first listen to how it sounded on TV. And that's what this was a television spectacle. Everyone remembers where they were watching this. Then we'll discuss with our panel, did Armstrong misspeak when he made that famous line about one small step?
Okay. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footpads are only pressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine.
Boy, look at those pictures. Wow. It's a little shadowy, but he said he expected that in the shadow of the lunar module. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I think that was Neil's quote. I didn't understand it.
No, one small step for man, but I didn't get the second phrase. One of our monitors here at our space headquarters is able to hear that. We'd like to know what it was.
The surface is fine and powdery. I can pick it up loosely with my toe. It does adhere in fine layers, like powdered charcoal, to the sole and sides of my boot.
His quote was, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I can see the footprints of my boots and the treads in the fine sandy particles. Neil, this is Houston. We're copying.
Oh, thank you, television, for letting us watch this one.
Isn't this something? 240 miles, 1,000 miles out there in the moon, and we're seeing this history being made.
There seems to be no difficulty in moving around as we suspected. It's even perhaps easier than the simulations of 16G that we performed in various simulations on the ground. Absolutely no trouble to walk around.
One of the great controversies of history. And I was just reading, they've analyzed now, back and analyzed the transmission. I don't know that we'll ever know, but it's a phrase that he came up with. Yeah. I don't think anybody told him what to say, and I don't think anybody knew what he was going to say until he actually made that step.
Yeah. And the We like to honor his intent because the intent was there for a man.
Yes,
and
the intent was there.
To be clear, so in the official transcripts at NASA, it appears as an A with parentheses. So just in case it satisfies both sides.
Yeah.
Armstrong and Aldrin spent 2.5 hours about on the moon. Buzz joins them about 20 minutes after Armstrong steps off. It's actually Buzz's photo on the cover of our episode. If you look at our Ohio v. the Moon episode cover, there really weren't very many pictures of Neil. Buzz was running around doing experiments as Neil, but really Neil took more of the pictures. And that picture that we famous one of them saluting the flag, it's really of Buzz. And we asked the panel, what were they doing while people on Earth looked up and celebrated that Sunday evening, July 20th?
Well, they have a pretty delineated flight plan. There are several things they want to do. It's not going to be an extended expedition. The two primary goals of Apollo 11 were to put boots on the moon and then, by golly, get home alive. So they had 2.5 hours to play with. So they wanted to set up some experiments, not a ton of them. Buzz was primarily responsible for setting up these experiments or deploying them. So he had the solar wind composition experiment, which was a pole with basically a fancy tinfoil sheet that they would collect and bring back. Collect samples of the solar wind. He had something called the ESEP, which was the Early Apollo Surface Experiments Package. And this contained 2 experiments. One was the PSEP, or the Passive Seismic Experiment, which he did deploy. The second was the Laser Ranging Retro Reflector, and don't ask me to say that again. So that was going to be used to actually measure the distance between the Earth and the Moon. In fact, it is still being used today. There were 3 of them deployed on the Moon's surface, the first one on Apollo 11. Right.
Well, Buzz was busy doing these, and he would be the one to take the pictures of Neil, and he didn't have much time to do that, so most of the pictures were taken by Neil. This one thing that's always fascinated me is this laser reflector thing that was mentioned. It's kind of like if you're a golfer, you have your rangefinder, and a lot of times on the flag there'll be a little reflecting device, and that's exactly what this is. And yet today, as Greg just mentioned, I think scientists can have a laser pointed at that little reflector that they left there and still can measure the exact distance between the Earth and the Moon. And to me, that's always been a fascinating thing, remnant that's still active from that mission.
Yeah. So they're doing that. So Buzz is doing those things. Neil gets out. The very first thing he does is basically grab a contingency sample. It's just a small little bag on the end of a handle.
They keep asking him to get it, too.
Yeah.
It's kind of like he's so wowed by being on the
moon. He's so wowed, yeah.
Neil, where are we at on that contingency sample?
Oh, so it took him a little longer than they thought he would, but he puts that in his suit pocket. And then he goes about photographing and also examining the LEM, and the surface area. He has to describe basically what the surface of the moon, the regolith, or that soil looks like underneath the rocket engine, and he needs to take a lot of photographs. So he's doing that. Buzz then comes out 20 minutes later, and Buzz has to do some of that inspection too, but Buzz, not only is he doing the ESEP and the solar wind composition experiment, he's got to collect a core sample, which is a documented sample. There were also bulk samples, which Neil collected and Buzz collected. In other words, there was no particular order or intent in you just look down there and see a rock or a sample of soil, and you just put it in a bag, and that's what that bulk sample is. And then, of course, they had to erect the American flag, which is a 3x5. And they had to have a small conversation, or short one, with President Nixon. So they did that.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House.
And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure that they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. one in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here representing not only the United States, but men of peace of all nations, and with interest and a curiosity and with a vision for the future. Honor for us to be able to participate here today.
And thank you very much, and I look forward, all of us look forward to seeing you on the Hornet on Thursday.
They blast off and reconnect in lunar orbit with the Columbia, with Michael Collins. And they make their trip back to the Earth. And they land in the Pacific Ocean. They're swept up by the Navy, put on the USS Hornet. And they land with just fanfare. Neil Armstrong is the most famous person in the world. And what do you think the first thing they do, him and Collins and Aldrin, when they land and splash down in the ocean? They're quarantined, and they're put into an Airstream. You know Airstream, those travel trailers are the aluminum, rounded, like super distinct. I love Airstreams. I love when I see them. They make me smile when I see them. I have some friends who have one. My aunt, when I go down and see Miss Ohio View of the World, and I go stay in Cabo on vacation, when I read all my history books on the beach, my aunt lives down there. She's got an Airstream on her property. She's got a nice house, but she's also got an Airstream on top of the little mountain that they live on. We actually sat down with the historian for Airstream, a great Ohio company in Jackson Center, Ohio, Northwest Ohio, really just down the road from Wapakoneta. We sat down with Samantha Martin to talk about the quarantine, the space cooties, the reason that they were in this Airstream. And they're there for almost 3 weeks. There's that famous picture that we'll talk about with President Nixon outside the Airstream and all three of them laughing through the window. And we'll talk about the MQF, the mobile quarantine facility that the astronauts spent 17 days in upon landing.
MQF, yeah. So MQF stands for Mobile Quarantine Facility. And so as NASA was working on the moon landings, there was a concern of lunar contamination. And so an agency was formed called the Interagency Committee on Back Contamination. And it was a group of organizations concerned with public health. And so they determined that they wanted to keep the astronauts quarantined. But in the meantime, from the landing in the ocean to the lunar receiving laboratory, they were looking for a mobile quarantine unit. And so NASA contracted with Melpar Inc., who then subcontracted with Airstream to build a total of 4 MQFs. They were essentially modified Airstream trailers. They were 35 feet long and adapted so that they could be transported on the ship and the cargo plane. And so it was a sealed aluminum shell with exhaust fans and filters that allowed for a negative pressure, internal negative pressures for biological isolation. There was a decontamination transfer lock to allow for the astronauts to send out the samples and films that they had collected. And other than that, there were living facilities, as you'd find in a standard Airstream at the time. There was a kitchen, a bathroom, a microwave, but instead of where the credenza normally was, you had a medical examination table, and it was situated to fit up to 6 people for 5 days.
So what was their fear? I mean, I know I use the joking term space cooties, but was it just they just didn't know?
Yeah, I guess it was more fear of the unknown, in that perhaps if there was some unknown bacteria that the astronauts could then bring back and no one here would have built up immunity to that, it was the concern of how to keep them quarantined to make sure that didn't happen. And the MQFs were used for Apollo 11, 12, and 14. And after Apollo 14, it was determined that that wasn't really a threat, and so the program was abandoned at that point.
What are they doing? How are they entertaining, the Apollo 11 astronauts are in there for almost 3 weeks, right?
Yeah, well, so they had, comfortable lounge areas. They had bunk beds, and it was the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts, but also their surgeon and the one of the program engineers in there with them. And so they ate, they slept, they worked on reports, kind of talked about their experience, met with President Nixon. And that's right outside of the MQF, as the 3 of them were kind of peeking out of the rear window.
Thanks so much to Samantha for joining us from Airstream. They are doing a big expansion. They're going to have a welcome center and museum. The actual MQF Airstream that Neil Armstrong was in is still on loan and display to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in D.C., one of my favorite museums in the country, and you can go check it out there. They're released in August. They go on a massive world tour, a ticker tape parade through New York, just like you'd imagine it from back in the day. State dinner with Nixon and leaders at the White House in D.C., another great parade in Chicago, and later that day off to Los Angeles. And then they go on a world tour. And we asked Brittany Venturella, the interim director, to tell us about, when Neil goes on that world tour. But first, he comes back to a parade in Wapak in September of 1969.
One of our highlights, I do want to mention before their international leg, would be them returning to, or Neil returning to Wapakoneta, his hometown. And it would have been on September 7th. He participated, he and his family would have went down Auglaize Street, through our historic downtown, through crowds of people. You would have had banners saying, "Welcome home, Neil," all across the town. And Bob Hope and his wife were also there. They were the Grand Marshals. We had Albert Sabin, the inventor of the polio vaccine, Ed McMahon, and they were all joined in the celebration. Also, Governor Rhodes was here, and as well as the OSU Marching Band. Nice. So that was a nice, band on the land. Yeah. So
that's only in really weeks after they got out of.
Yes.
Got out of quarantine, yes.
Yes. And so they also would have then participated in speeches at the Auglaize County Fairgrounds, which is also in Wapakoneta. So it was a very large celebration. And then at the end of the month, they would have started the international leg. So by the time they got done with all of these celebrations, they would have visited 6 continents, if you include the United States and North America. And some of the highlights, we always hear about the parades and touring through the cities, as well as meeting world leaders, the Pope, royalty.
Queen Elizabeth, I think. Yeah.
Correct, yes, and the other members of the royal family. But there's some other things that are maybe not known as much. For example, in Turkey, they laid a wreath at a World War I memorial. They laid a wreath in Berlin at the Berlin Wall to commemorate those who did not survive their attempt to cross the Berlin Wall. But then they also did some fun things as well. They went grouse or bird hunting, duck hunting. They also participated in Zaire in a moon ball where they were treated to traditional dancing, as well as dances that the people there actually choreographed for them in honor of the Apollo 11 moon landing. And they also then got to partake in general dancing as well. So it was a wide range of activities.
Neil's given speeches at all those types of events as well. I mean, that had to be exhausting.
Yes, definitely. And a lot of stops, so 23 countries.
I would just say I think I might be the only one at this table that was actually there at the parade where I don't think you were born.
No, my mom and dad didn't want to come down here for the traffic.
But I was in college, and I was here for the parade. Yeah, it was a huge parade. There was another, when he went on the Gemini mission, some people forget that. There was another huge parade. I actually marched in that as a member of the St. Mary's marching band.
Oh, really?
I was still in high school then.
And that would have been 66?
66.
Yeah, in 66, I think was a
Might have been
senior
April,
in
I'm
high
not
school.
sure.
Or maybe a junior, but yeah, our band came over from St. Mary's and we marched in the parade honoring Neil when he returned from the Gemini. And I think that was pretty standard, for John and Glenn. These people, the Gemini astronauts, the Apollo astronauts, they were heroes. There were lots of articles in the mass publications about their activity. They were treated today like movie stars, we would, celebrities.
It's sad that we have to even do this, but we'd regret if we didn't discuss, the conspiracy that surrounds Apollo 11. And did Neil Armstrong really land on the moon? These conspirators, they don't answer whether, Apollo 12 or 14 or 15 or 16. If they landed, it's really about Apollo 11, the one that was the first one. It's sad that we've gotten, if you've gotten upset about the baseless claims of conspiracy, please go on YouTube and watch Buzz Aldrin punches one of these Apollo 11 truthers right in the face. The guy's harassing him at a hotel. It's fantastic. You really should go watch it. Just Buzz Aldrin punches man would be enough to find it. But this BS about the flag and the shadows and the different, the lighting and all that's can be very, I think, easily explained and understood when you understand the different planet that they're on. They're on the moon. It doesn't always play by the exact same shadowing and lighting rules, that we have here. And with the gravity situation and the atmosphere, all that stuff can be explained. Not to mention the tens of thousands of people around the globe that worked on this project. Not a soul has come forward saying it was a hoax. Sadly, we had to ask our panel, and they give some new pieces of proof I never really thought about after we discussed some of the, the more obvious ones and debunking the conspiracy theories about Neil Armstrong and Apollo 11.
One of them is that the laser reflector that they put on there. You couldn't get that bouncing back from a laser unless they had actually physically placed that on the moon. So in my mind, that's always been one of the key, if you want evidence for doubters, that's used still on a daily basis, I assume, by some, scientists.
Mm-hmm. That's just one of the many good arguments. Some people might say, well, how do we know that some unmanned spacecraft didn't land it there? Well, honestly, if we could land an unmanned spacecraft there and place that there, why couldn't we put a person there? Another couple of good examples of, I should say, countervening evidences are the massive amounts of rocks that we brought back. The lunar samples we brought back total over 800 pounds of rocks and soil. And some people might also say, well, how do we know they're not just faked, or how do we know that they're real lunar samples? Well, lunar samples aren't the same as Earth samples. There are several major differences. We don't have sedimentary rocks on the moon. Those are created by flowing water. Lunar rocks are anhydrous, that is, they don't have water in them. They typically don't contain quartz, calcite, magnetite, amphiboles. They don't contain micas, and Earth rocks do. Many Earth rocks do. So that's kind of another example of something I would use. And after 40-some years, and nobody has stepped forward and said we didn't go, anyone who was a part of that program has maintained that actually happened.
I think that's the strongest.
It's really difficult to imagine.
Anybody who has studied the career and life of Neil Armstrong would quickly believe that he would absolutely not take part in any such review. He wasn't that type of individual. If anybody, the term Boy Scout comes to mind, was he wouldn't be involved in any program that was a fake.
No, I can't.
And just the tens of thousands of people who worked on it, right?
Right.
Absolutely. You had people across the nation involved in this. All of these companies, some of the ones we were mentioning before, to be that elaborate and also that expensive of a project.
Yeah.
For it to be a hoax is just, for me, unbelievable.
It's absurd.
Yes.
It's absurd.
Neil's still with NASA. The world tour ends, and he's still one of the most famous people in the world. Certainly, I think the most famous Ohioan when it's all said and done. But he was also an introvert. He didn't seek the limelight and all the attention, the speeches he had to give on all these tours and interviews. It's not what he wanted for him or his family. And he walks away. And could I ask myself sometimes if I could have done that? Or if I would have just opened a burger chain, Space Burgers, or if, I don't know, done commercials and just moved to LA and New York and been a celebrity and lived that life. I think Neil Armstrong, honestly, for a while could have done that. He was that big. But Neil bails, and he walks away from NASA in 1971, and he moves back to Ohio. He moves down to Lebanon, Ohio. He buys a farm with the kids and Janet. And in 1971, he takes a job. He becomes a professor. And he leaves the public eye at the height of his fame.
But he was offered his professorship at University of Cincinnati. He left NASA and became a professor between 71 and 79. That was something, as we've researched and seen, or read, that was an interest of his from before as well. So it wasn't just a pop-up, oh, that's great. That's something he was
What did he teach?
Interested in. Aerospace engineering.
Well, that makes sense. Okay.
Yes.
He wasn't a history teacher, no. Neil didn't like how the space program stalled. He thought for sure we'd be on Mars before the end of the century. People living on the moon, the space stations in the sky, in the space. He stays involved. He's the co-chair of the Rogers Committee that investigates the Challenger disaster in 1986. He stays involved with NASA and with Purdue. But he would have been saddened, and he was saddened, by the lack of sophistication we have in 2018. When Neil passed away, he'd written an open letter about his frustration with the government and people losing interest in what he deemed to be a very worthy pursuit, something important to the human experience. Now, that being said, we do play this clip just from a few months ago. And we may have a president who has some interest in space. Yes, we're talking about Space Force.
My administration is reclaiming America's heritage as the world's greatest spacefaring nation. The essence of the American character is to explore new horizons and to tame new frontiers. But our destiny beyond the Earth is not only a matter of national identity, but a matter of national security. So important for our military, so important, and people don't talk about it. When it comes to defending America, it is not enough to merely have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. So important. Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement. We are going to have the Air Force and we are going to have the Space Force, separate but equal.
Say what you will about Space Force. It's pretty. It seems like a silly name, but I am one for space exploration. And Neil faced down these arguments in before his mission. Why should we be paying for this? Why should? And he's asked, and he talks about because it's important. Neil Armstrong lives out his life in Southwest Ohio, in Lebanon and Cincinnati for the rest of his life. He's involved in a lot of boards and charities, like we said, Purdue and NASA, and events, and he passes away in 2012. He was an American hero. And what he did in 1969, Brittany, we talk about all these moments that you remember where you were. Pearl Harbor, the JFK assassination. My generation, it's 9/11. You remember where you were. Brittany talks about how those moments were all tragedies, but not Apollo 11, not Neil Armstrong in this great adventure when man landed on the moon.
Think about, a lot of people ask where were you when something happened? And when we think about that in history, it's a lot of tragedies. However, this was one event that brought the world together for a success and a great achievement, and that many people across the world joined in to make sure that could happen.
From Garfield's tomb to the Serpent Mound, from the big cities to the river towns, first in flight making history. There's so many books you need to see. I like reading, and I like reading. Tip a canoe and Tyler too, from the Queen City to Lake Erie Blue, Edison and a man on the moon. So many books, which will we choose? I like reading. I like reading.
Our book recommendation, guys, is First Man by James Hansen. The movie is based on this book. There's a lot of great books I read. A lot of great documentaries you can watch, From the Earth to the Moon. I think that was originally on HBO. Tom Hanks produced, great documentary series. But go see First Man. It's really a book recommendation and a movie recommendation. They made a feature film about Ohio history, and it is, like I said, really well done by director Damien Chazelle. A great performance by Claire Foy as Janet Armstrong, and Deke Slayton, played by one of my favorite actors, Kyle Chandler, from Bloodline. And he's also in Wolf of Wall Street. He was the coach in Friday Night Lights. Awesome actor, really does a lot of cool stuff. So go see that movie. Our schedule, we're going to have another episode next Friday, the 19th, same day as our launch party. That'll be episode 2, and we'll be talking about bootlegging, Ohio versus bootlegging. We'll be looking at Prohibition, the king of the bootleggers, George Remus from Cincinnati, Ohio. An incredible story. And we'll talk about Prohibition again in the state of Ohio. It's one of our most listened to episodes. And we go down to Cincinnati and really have a great episode there. And we're excited to bring that to you next Friday, which is also, again, our Season 3 launch party, live band karaoke, dinner, drinks. It's Columbus Italian Club, October 19th, 7 o'clock till 7 to 11-ish. But we'd love to have all our friends down there, all our listeners. Feel free to bring any of your friends. Again, it's not going to be a real history-centric night. It's really more of a party just to celebrate the new season of Ohio v. the World. Rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever else it is. Our biggest thing, guys, is just word of mouth. Tell your friends. Share this episode on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have a Twitter page now at Ohio v. the World. We got an Instagram, Ohio v. the World podcast. And check us out on Facebook or email us. You got a show idea, ohiovtheworld@gmail.com. Moving forward, we will be doing episodes and dropping them on Sundays. Just these first 2 will be Fridays, because we want to get content out to you guys here at the beginning, and then it'll be every other Sunday from there on moving forward. And we're looking forward to being with you all the way through the spring of next year. So thanks for listening to episode 1. We'll see you guys next time for Ohio versus bootlegging.
Columbia